Welcome to the Ding Darling Wildlife Society lecture series. Hi, my name is Jeff Decker, and I am the philanthropic director. The Wildlife Society is the nonprofit arm for the Jane Ding Darling Wildlife Refuge, and we help them with funding, and we also help do outreach programs such as this. And this particular program was sponsored by friends of ours, very generously. And I'd like to thank some of the volunteers and some of the staff and some of our donors that I see in the audience, so thank you so much for coming. Our next speaker, I had the privilege of having lunch with right before. This was the first time I got to meet him. And he is a member of the Tuscarora Nation of North Carolina, and he served his community as a culture keeper and a historian. He founded the Descendant Institute of Conservancy of Southwest Florida, and last year he published his book, The Spanish Seminole, The Untold Story of the Spanish Indians, that's shared by a descendant. And he has those books for sale, that he'll be signing right after the lecture, right by the nature store. So without further ado, I just want to introduce you to David Rahahę Webb.
Right. Thank you everybody for coming, and thanks to the Society for having me here. My mother used to work for the Society back when I was a kid, so you'll learn a little bit about my family on Seminole Island. So another thing before we start is just to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Calusa and the Seminole and Miccosukee people, and if you're not familiar, you'll learn about them today. All right, so a little bit about me. The building right across from this building is the admin building, but that used to be the only refuge building, if you recall, if you were around then. And the name on that building is my grandma's name, Edith Stokes. She worked for the refuge for 30 plus years and was one of those people who retired and then never really retired. She kept coming back and contracting or volunteering and helping them find where everything was because they couldn't find it when she left. But my great-grandfather was the first employee of the refuge, period. And he, I like to tell this little story that when they hired him here, they asked him to do bird surveys, regular bird surveys. And, what are the populations of the wading birds? And he said, I ain't counting no damn birds. And then I, in the 90s, was an intern here, and I had to count birds. So this is, I've just found out I have a pointer, so this is helpful. So my degree's in environmental science, and went to Florida Gulf Coast University. I've worked with largely marine science, but environmental education primarily. So I've done a lot of work with sea turtles. I lived on the East Coast for a while, oversaw the sea turtle program for Miami-Dade County. And this was actually when I worked for the Conservancy of Southwest Florida in Naples. We used to raise little hatchling turtles up to 43 centimeters or whatever of the carapace size and release them. So that was one of the fun days we got to release one. And this is my community in North Carolina. There's me, the weird one in the back. This is our longhouse. These are my aunties who were just here at the last talk, and they're on their way to a powwow that I'll see them at this weekend. And then these are my dad, my nephew, my niece. My nephew's running on what we call Indian time, so he'll get here when he gets here. And you'll see him strolling and interrupt. But my grandma Edie, did any of you know Edie Stokes? No? Oh, that's sad. I did. She was really awesome. What about Esperanza Woodring? Ever heard of Esperanza? Yeah, everybody's heard of Esperanza. So there's my grandma and Esperanza. My parents and me, I think, like in the Islander or something when I was a baby. That's my great-granddad, Jake Stokes, who worked here at the refuge. He was also like the sheriff's deputy for the island for a while. And that was his mom, who was a descendant of the Spanish Indians, or the Spanish Seminole. And her ancestors were the very first family documented on Seminole Island in the early 1800s, before it was part of the U.S. So that's largely what the book is based on. The end. Just kidding. So here is Jake with a tarpon he caught, probably up around Boca Grande. That was him on his wedding day, looking dapper. Here he is out in Pine Island Sound. I don't know what dock that is, could be Old Bailey's dock. And he found this big diamondback rattler swimming across Pine Island Sound. And these are relatives from the Montes de Oca family. So that is our family that extends back here on the island. And this was his grandmother, Josie Montes de Oca, and her sister, Azaline. More Montes de Oca. So the family, you'll find at the end of the presentation, I talk about it a little bit, but all up and down the barrier islands from Sanibel up to Tampa Bay. And they worked as commercial fishermen back before it was really commercial fishing. It was a lifestyle. And in my book at the end, I have an interview by my granddad, or from my granddad, where he talks about the life that he lived here on the island. When I was a kid, my great-grandparents had a house right on Periwinkle Way. There's I don't know if it's still a boat repair shop, but it's kind of across from, gosh, it's over kind of near where Jerry's. I don't know if Jerry's is still there. I moved off island a few years ago. And then this is some relatives. That's Buddy Montes de Oca on their horse and buggy in Kissimmee. So if you ever read A Land Remembered, if you haven't, I recommend you read it. It's about the old Florida cattleman, cowboy lifestyle, and that's how they lived. This part of the family moved over and started cattle ranches. So my research methodologies is based in sort of having two, 1 foot in each canoe, like the Western canoe and the indigenous. We value the importance of citing sources and using peer-reviewed materials and primary sources. So throughout this work, if you haven't looked at it yet, I hope you do, everything has sources cited. That's our sort of Western academic methodology. And I also include indigenous methodologies in this, which include things like oral history. So you'll hear me reference that. I already referenced my grandfather's oral history. But what that does is it sort of, we say it decolonizes our lens that we're seeing things through. So essentially, history has been written by people who have one certain perspective. And by what we say, when we say decolonizing that, we are adding perspectives of the colonized, of indigenous people, that is through a different lens of understanding the land differently, and history and language and place very differently. So things like oral history are valued in most indigenous cultures. All right, how many of you have heard of the Seminole? Great, you're awake. How many of you have heard of the Spanish Indians? Good, a few of you. Last time I don't know if there were that many hands. So the Spanish Indians were actually Spanish Seminole people. For years, people really wondered who the Spanish Indians were. They inhabited the barrier islands, including Sanibel, where my family was, in the period kind of between the collapse of the Calusa Empire, or kingdom, to the time when the United States took over Florida. So people wondered, what were their origins? Were they Seminole? Were they Miccosukee? Two different language groups? Were they Calusa? And so we know they were all of the above. We'll talk about that a little bit, but the big myth is you'll hear about like Cuban ranchos throughout the islands, and they're often referred to as Cuban ranchos or fisheries. My research in this book found that Cubans were a very small minority of the Hispanic Latino men who were part of these fisheries. My family was the only Cuban family documented in any of the baptism records that I'll show you. They were based out of Regla, Cuba. Sorry, I'm going to go back and forth between Spanish and English pronunciation. So they were based out of Regla, Cuba, which is in Havana Bay, right on the inside. So that is the port of call for all of these fisheries. So that's why a lot of people thought they were Cuban. And we know that the people here identified as Seminole themselves for a couple of reasons. One, in the baptism records, some of them actually said they were, the records said they were from Seminole. And we have a petition that my family was on that they were petitioning, white men petitioned on their behalf as Seminoles. So I talked about them being Miccosukee and Creek or Seminole. So we had a couple of different groups of indigenous people that had always been in Florida, but migrated down more permanently into the peninsula, and they spoke two different languages. So the Seminole tribe of Florida today, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma that were removed to Oklahoma, and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. And then there are also a number of independent Seminole communities who have never come in under those tribes that remain independent in the Everglades. They speak various languages. Most of the people in the southern part of Florida speak the Miccosukee language or Yakadishi or Ilapongi in their own language. And then East Ijadi is the Creek language that the dominant Seminole tribe speaks predominantly. We also know that indigenous tribes of Florida were incorporated in. Their oral histories have always said that they incorporated in the tribes here. The writers of history often said that they came and displaced and replaced the indigenous people of Florida. That's not 100% true. It's a little more complicated than that. And we know one example of oral history is from Jimmy Osceola that I share in my book. And this is the kind of information that in indigenous methodologies you have to get permission to use. So speaking to community members and also finding this in a recording of his interview. This is a story that they have about one of their clans. So they have a clan called the Tacoshafle, which just means taco people. And the reason why it's called that goes back to the story. So when the ancestors of the Miccosukee, the Ilapongi speaking people came down to this area, they encountered people that were remnants of the people who lived here before, probably the Clusa. And when they talked to them, they couldn't understand each other. So the words just sounded like taco, 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 taco to them, right? So like sometimes you may be speaking to somebody who speaks a language you don't understand, and it just sounds something like that. So taco shafle just means taco people. And they were incorporated in and formed their own clan, and they still exist today as a clan. Another important feature is adoption. In indigenous societies, adoption is an incredibly important custom. Now, the history of Florida, how many of you were aware that Florida went through a period where Great Britain claimed Florida? Yeah, a few of you. So the ones in the front rows, they're all getting an A today. Sorry. So Florida changed hands multiple times from the original indigenous owners of the land, keepers of the land, to the Spanish who came and claimed it, even though none of them lived here. They said, we claimed this for Spain. So in 1513, Ponce de Leon came, and he attempted to form a colony, but the Clusa kicked his rear end, and they actually shot him with what is believed to be a poison dart, and he died from that actual puncture wound. And they kept the Spanish away for over 100 years from Southwest Florida. The Spanish went and formed missions all across northern Florida, from St. Augustine to Pensacola, a whole string of missions across the northern part of the state. But they didn't dare come down to this area because of the Clusa. Finally, the Clusa, fishermen started working with the Clusa. They started having trade, which opened things up and to Spain. And then Spain actually had a colony here for a year and a half or so until that went south. And that colony, anybody know where that colony was? Or not colony, mission? Anybody know where that mission was? Yeah? Where?
Near the Mound House?
Mound Key, yeah. So Mound Key, where Mound House is on Fort Myers Beach, behind there in the bay is Mound Key, which was the capital of really a vast political territory for the Clusa. And it's an awesome place if you can ever visit there. But that's where they had their mission. He describes a great house on top of one of the mounds that could fit 2,000 people inside of it. It's a really cool thing to read about. So then the Clusa political body fell by the 1670s, and that was largely due to the British. So the Indian slave trade was a major source of the economy in the British colonies, especially out of South Carolina. So Charleston was exporting people as commodities out as a huge economic source for them. and they were trading with the indigenous tribes that were most close to them, like the Creeks in Georgia and South Carolina, down around that border area. And the Creeks were raiding down into Florida, Creek-speaking people, and kidnapping and taking people from here up and selling them to the British. The British were taking them down to the Caribbean for work on their sugar plantations. So that, along with disease, decimated the populations of Florida's indigenous tribes. The Miccosukee people have always lived in the panhandle of Florida and always used areas like Big Cypress as traditional territories. This is a photo I took from El Morro in Havana. Have any of you ever been there? It's a really cool spot. So you can see, there's the bay, and you can see across it is the actual city of Havana. The reason I have this here is this was a critical location for Spain's empire in the Americas. So this was, if you could imagine ships coming in and out, we know that Sir Walter Raleigh came through, and all sorts of piracy happened between the British attacking Spanish galleons and stealing gold and people off of those galleons. But this spot was very strategic because it kind of guarded access into areas like Mexico and Colombia, Cartagena. And this was considered really the hub for Florida. So La Florida, the territory claimed as La Florida, extended from the Keys, from Key West, up to what's now about Virginia, the Virginia state line. And so that territory was all governed by Pedro Menendez at the time, that a lot of this colonization happened. And battles, the War of 1812, there were all sorts of battles and wars that took place that pulled in other nations and tribes and people from all across what we call North America. So this was a really strategic hub. And as we talk about Florida kind of changing hands, Andrew Jackson started raiding into northern Florida illegally. So Florida was still claimed by Spain, but Spain didn't really have the funds to manage Florida. And so it was largely ungoverned. And the biggest presence here was via the missions that you can see sort of up in the top, some of those mission towns of this map. The people up there were Creek-speaking and Miccosukee-speaking people, so you'll see in some of the records how people migrated from these. This is the Apalachicola River, and this town up here, Choconicla, was a Miccosukee-speaking town. The town right under it, Ojisi, was a Creek-speaking town, so they were intermingled, politically allied at a time. We have other towns like Tamafli, that is a very ancient town, documented by some of the first Spanish missions to the area. And then other San Marcos was a fort, San Juan was a mission. We have St. Augustine, everybody's familiar with that, our oldest European city in North America. And Cimarrones, so this is where the term Seminoles comes from. And when we look in the Spanish documents, they're written as Cimarrones. And you can see them, this is representing the migration south. So then we get down into the barrier islands. And as Florida changed hands, the British took possession. Spain then took possession again. You can see the significant date there, 1812. It was like a trade. And then the Seminole Wars are actually resistance. These buttons are confusing me. There we go. So the Seminole Wars it was actually one long resistance. So if you talk to a Seminole or Miccosukee person today, it's referred to as one long war. And really a resistance against colonization. So some of those first treaties that were made, starting with the Adams-Onis Treaty, you're supposed to keep legal title. As you know from studying American treaties here on these lands, that didn't last very long. Also the treaties with the Seminole, like the Treaty of Payne's Landing, gave a large part of the state as a reservation set aside for the Seminole, and that would just shrink and shrink and shrink. And at the time, indigenous people, Native Americans, were not allowed off of reservations. So people were restricted like a concentration camp, essentially. You know, you have an ethnic cleansing, moving of people, and then they're put on lands equivalent to what we would call a concentration camp. So the United States takes possession in 1821, and around that same time, that's when we see people really moving down, because Andrew Jackson starts burning down towns in the Panhandle. So those towns up here that I mentioned, there was actually a town right up here, Miccosukee, that was one of the main Miccosukee towns. He burned that town down. It was a really large town. So he would bring these raiding parties with militias down into northern Florida and attack the Seminoles. And then if you read my book, you'll find that there's a lot of really interesting diplomacy and sort of taking advantage of that vacuum that the indigenous people did here in the States. So siding with Britain or siding with Spain at different times, using that strategically to their own advantage. They would often take rides on schooners from these fisheries down to Havana to meet with the governor. And some of these records, the people they brought down on those trips were members of my family and other families from the ranchos. And they actually went down so much, the custom would be that when a tribe leader visits, you have to give them gifts. And so the governor of Cuba was so frustrated with the amount of Seminole people and Miccosukee people coming for gifts, he said, no more, don't let them come anymore. But they would come back wearing like really nice shirts and some really cool clothes and have pots and pans and guns, which was important. So now looking at Southwest Florida specifically, we know our beloved Sanibel. The rancho here was located on Tarpon Bay, and there was one over here on Punta Rasa, Kea Costa, and we had a rancho at Yusepa. We'll talk about the name for Yusepa a little bit, Cayo Pilao. And then something really cool is if you ever look at a map, Google some of the names of the islands, because there's some really cool history there. For instance, Chino Island is named after an Asian man who was either enslaved or in servitude, who was brought here and during a raid had escaped, and so they named the island Chinese guy, Chino Island, that's what that means. Then there's a little island here, Regla, that refers to the port of call in Cuba. So some really cool history there, and even the history just around the name of Yusepa Island is really cool. So some statistics, there were 600 Spanish Seminole people, or Spanish Indians, that were documented when the Americans took possession of the region. Only about 20% of that population could be identified by name. They were documented in a baptism record or a land deed, putting in a claim with the U.S. government saying that they had that land, entitled to the land prior to the Adams-Onis Treaty. There were some that were in early censuses. This was part of Manatee County at one time, and at one time it was part of the same county that went all the way down from Tampa to the Keys. So you can find some individuals listed in those records. And the people were documented moving from the Panhandle down together. And how many of you have heard of the fur trade or the deerskin trade around the Great Lakes, the fur trade, the beaver wars, those sorts of things? So that was a very significant event for that region. And it was an economic shift to an entirely different economic system for the indigenous people that involved going out and hunting and trading furs for commodities and things like fabric or pots and pans or guns, hatchets, things like that. The fisheries here in Southwest Florida served the same cultural purpose. So it was a large industry. 8,000 pounds of fish were exported annually. It fed all of the Havana area. These were the fisheries that fed the city of Havana. All of the enslaved people were fed fish that came from here, and that was a really large population. And then during Lent, it was especially important. So at first these fisheries were seasonal operations, and then people settled here and intermarried with the Seminole women. Men settled here and intermarried with the Seminole women, and they became year-round operations. So something else that we know, a lot of people will say that, that have studied this in the past will say that creolization occurred. And creolization is when two or more cultures really kind of blend together. And that really didn't occur in these fisheries from what the evidence shows. There was no evidence of religion or Christian religion here. There was not any churches or chapels or anything like that. There weren't priests living here. The people were not Christianized. In fact, only one of the Seminole mothers in these baptism records was mentioned as being in the process of converting to Catholicism. They kept their languages intact, etc. But the big thing was that all of this trade from these fisheries supplied arms, and so you're getting guns and powder and ammo for the Seminoles. One interesting thing about the Spanish Seminole people is this example of Chaqueca Chobi. His Spanish name was Antonio Niqueca. He belonged to the Wind clan of the Miccosukee people, and he was behind the battle at the Caloosahatchee. So this was one of the major battles, depending on how you look at it, in Southwest Florida anyway, on the Caloosahatchee River. So he led that attack, and it was written that the Spanish Indians from this area were a band of Seminole people. Now we get a little bit into the baptism, which is kind of cool, the baptism records. So this is a look at that fort, the same fort that I had the photo of from the bay, and you can see a schooner. This is the type of boat that carried the Spanish Seminole people or the Seminole people back and forth from Florida to Havana. And so the church they went to was right on the port in Regla. So we have Regla's back here. This is the entrance. Here's the city of Havana. The fort is up here in the corner. And so this was the port of call. So these boats were coming in and out. At one time, Regla was a really bustling town. On one of my trips to Havana, I found a book in like a street market that I just bought. It was like old stories it was like lore from Cuba. And so I brought it home, and as I was reading through it, I found some references that I included in the book because it talked about how Regla was a really thriving city, and then it just really shifted to being, when the economy for that area collapsed and the fisheries stopped, it just went to hell, as they would say. But this is the church for Nuestra Señora de la Regla. This is her. She is the Virgin of Regla, and you can see she's represented as a brown-skinned woman. And this was a place where a lot of people of color were baptized. So the books with the baptism records that I translated and have in my book, these books, including the baptisms, were mostly made up of enslaved African people or free African people. And then every so often you would see a record that said Indian of Florida. And so they were being brought down to this church. And here's an example of one of those records from my own family. This is Juan Montes de Oca. You can see he was born in Choconicla, the town of Choconicla, near Apalachee. So that was a province, kind of near where Apalachicola is. Gregorio Montes de Oca was his father, and his mother was Rita McDowga, which I've talked to my friends who speak Seminole language and Miccosukee language, and they don't know what that means. And here we have Rita de Los Angeles Montes de Oca. She was from, look at this, Sanibel. And so you can see that her father Gregorio and Rita moved down to Sanibel from Choconicla. Choconicla means burnt house. So if you ever heard of a chicky hut, Choconicla has the same root, Choco Chiqui, for house. And so we have it's signed here by the priest, but you can see that clear migration from the panhandle down here. So there were 42 parents listed in these baptism records. And all of the mothers were indigenous. All of the mothers were Miccosukee or Creek speaking. And then 5 of the fathers were listed as Indian. 16 of the fathers were Hispanic or Latino, and several of them were native or mestizo. An example of that are these Campechanos. They were actually Maya people. So the Maya revolted against Spain in the Yucatan, and they removed a bunch of them from the Yucatan and settled them in Cuba, right outside of Havana. And they were actually working in these ranchos, and they had children with Seminole women. Now, 3 of the fathers were from Spain, or they were Spanish anyway, and they were probably 100% European, from either Caracas or the Canary Islands. That's where the Montes de Ocas came from before that. 1 Cuban was Gregorio Montes de Oca, and here you see about Rita Magalga, Indian of Choconicla. 6 children had no father listed, and 16 of the 30 children had a surname, and about half of that didn't have a surname and just said Indian after their name. So, some interesting things about this. Thinking about the fact that all these kids are baptized in the Catholic Church, what kind of strikes you as being a little weird? Any thoughts?
Unmarried.
Yeah.
Unmarried parents.
The parent, I mean, how would the parents have gotten married? Maybe they could have come to Havana at another point, or maybe up in the missions there was a priest, but there's no record of any marriages for any of these people. There was one guy who actually had a Seminole wife, and he had another wife back in Havana. And he tried to use an alias in the baptism records. It was very, very interesting. And some of these kids don't have fathers listed, and their mothers aren't Christian, and they wouldn't be eligible for baptism at that time, right? And the marriages would be seen as illegitimate. So very interesting that they were baptized in the standards. There must have been some reason for this that I haven't figured out. And now I'm sure you can read all the small print, but the book has it, so check out the book. But those are all the baptism records broken out of where people, who married whom, whose parentage was what. Even translators were important that were there because just for selfish reasons, like my family oftentimes translated. And but it's cool data. But you can see here the pattern. You've got these towns in the Panhandle. See people moving to Tampa. Then you see people in Punta Rasa. Then you see coming down to Yusepa Island. It was actually Cayo de Tia Cespas, the island of Uncle Cespa, and then Sanibel. And this is the Montes de Oca family tree. So it's really kind of interesting because some of this is a mystery. We know that Juan, my ancestor, spoke Spanish, English, Miccosukee, and Creek, and you'll find out why we know that. Marcelina also spoke Creek and Miccosukee because she was a translator on some of those records, as did Gregorio. He was a translator as well, and some of the baptisms for some of these other kids, like he would say what town they came from or who the mother was. The mother didn't always come up with the kid. They would say it was with the mother's permission. And so I'm not sure if Gregorio was Juan's dad or his brother. He could have been old enough to be his dad. And these three people speaking the indigenous languages, their mother was probably Miccosukee or Creek as well. So that would be the custom that they would be raised here. I've communicated back and forth with the Diocese of Havana, the Diocese of Matanzas. I've been down there, looked through records. They have written me letters saying there are no records of these individuals anywhere in Cuba, and those dioceses anyway. And also not in Mexico or some other colony. So Juan, his first wife, was probably part of the Trail of Tears. I'm sure you've heard of that, but Andrew Jackson, known as the Indian Killer, initiated the forced removals of at least 5 tribes in the southeast. So that included the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and they were and Creeks, and they were forcibly removed from their homes and sent out to Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma. And if you maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago, there was a Supreme Court case that found in favor of the Muskogee Nation that, in fact, about half of Oklahoma actually still belonged to the natives and was not It was a sovereign territory per those treaties. So, so a lot of women and children and men were forcibly removed from the ranchos directly, hundreds of them, and we'll see some of those numbers in a minute. But Juan had a couple of kids with his first wife, I don't know her name, and two of them stuck around here. One of them, Victoria, she was written about quite a bit. She was a very beautiful Seminole woman, according to what they wrote about. She married one of the first mayors of Tampa, Alfonso Delaney. He was French. And so they were Catholic, and Juan, along with Alfonso and others, founded the first Catholic church in Tampa. It's still there. His other daughter, Crusette, was born at sea, so she was probably born on one of those boats going back and forth. And she married another either Spanish Indian or Hispanic man in Tampa. And then his next wife was Mary, or Maria, and Mary was written about as a Seminole woman from a town next to Tampa, Sonora Sasa. They were my ancestors through their son Manuel, who had the nickname Canoe. I think he got that name in the Civil War. But interesting stuff. Then there were some Montes de Ocas who were mysteries, like, who's their baby daddy? So we have Dominga, who is a really cool character. Dominga married Maximo Hernandez. How many of you have driven across the Skyway Bridge, the Sunshine Skyway Bridge? Yeah. So as you're coming from St. Pete, there's a little park there called Maximo Park, and that is named after him. There's a little mound there, and they had a fishery there, a rancho. Dominga Montes de Oca was his wife. Their son was Maximo Jr. Their descendants are still in Tampa. In fact, we're going to have a family reunion of all of us Spanish Indian, Spanish Seminole descendants. The only families we know of are the Montes de Oca family and the Hernandez family. That there's descendants still there. But we're not sure who her parents were. She could have been Juan's daughter, or she could have been, because there were a lot of unaccounted for people. Gavino was in Key West on one of the U.S. censuses. He was born in 1835, and he just kind of disappeared, but he was written as Gavino Montes de Oca Indian. And then there was a John who was born in 1835. So, we don't really know the parentage of all of these Montes de Ocas. They got around. So the Sanibel Rancho is really another interesting piece, because there was an American surveyor who came down here speculating essentially to build a development. They wanted to develop Sanibel. And he came from New York. His name was Dr. Strobel in 1833. And he hired some of the Spanish Seminole people to build huts for him, like these. And so when he came here, he wrote that they're by far, principal inhabitants are Spaniards, but by far the largest number are Indians. They're employed by the Spaniards, and they go out in large canoes and catch fish. They use a net, and when the fishing season is over, they go into the country or neighboring islands and grow corn, sugarcane, pumpkins, etc. And something that's kind of cool is he described some dances. So they got in canoes from Tarpon Bay, the rancho, and they took the canoes across to Punta Rasa. And back then, the Causeway Islands weren't there. They put those islands in just for the causeway. So they went across the bay to Punta Rasa, and they had some dances. And so we actually, my tribe, the Tuscarora tribe, we actually still do these same types of dances, as do the Seminole and Miccosukee people. So he described that each woman strapped on deerskin 6 or 8 box turtle shells, and here's an example that's used in the present day. If somebody wants to make it out of shells, now people use things like condensed milk cans. And filling it with a seed, and then fastened to the cap, and we call them shakers, technical term, but it's really loud, and he described the tremendous and deafening sound. And one thing I'm going to show you is a video of me and cousins and others. This is at our annual powwow a few years ago, and we have a dance called the alligator dance. In our oral history about this dance, it was given to us by the Seminole when we helped them during the Seminole Wars. Something really interesting about it is I've heard that story basically all my life. There's me in the front and cousins. And so The story is that this dance came from the Seminole, but some years ago, I was going through some old Smithsonian recordings. I found a recording of Josie Billy, he's Miccosukee, and he's singing the exact same song that we sing, and literally wasn't the slightest bit different. And so that was really kind of cool to find. And the recording had at least 2 other songs that were alligator dance songs that we don't have. So it'll be neat to see if we can maybe bring some of those back in our community. And a little bit more about his time there. He slept really well because he felt safe. He said, you know, although I'm with like 6 or 8 Spaniards, 20 or 30 Indians, I'm a stranger, but I didn't feel any apprehension. I felt confident that their hospitality would not be violated. So something else out of this is my nerd self, you know, pulling statistics. So that's about maybe, from his estimate, about 16% of the population were Hispanic, Latino. The rest were Indian from the Sanibel rancho. And you'll hear me use the terms interchangeably. Most indigenous people like being called by their own nation or by our own nation. But Indian is a legal term, and so the US government and different states, we have treaties with them as Indian people, and so that is a term that applies to indigenous people. So you'll hear me use that interchangeably. Native American is a newer term. A lot of natives don't necessarily like that term because we're older than the concept of America. And so that is like, you know, we were here before America. So, but we have here the evacuation of the rancho. So how do you think the Spanish Seminoles from Sanibel and the islands here, what do you think happened to them? How do you think they left? Forced, yeah. One way or another forced. So this is kind of a like a saga. Like this would make a really cool movie. But the removals were well underway by 1836, the year that they left. The majority left. There were still some that stayed. There was an American officer stationed at Yusepa Island, and if you've ever been there, it's a pretty cool island. There's a big mound, and there were a number at the time. There were huts all around, and it was a really prolific fishery, using seine nets, catching all types of fish to then sell and send down to Cuba. And those exports drew a lot of attention from the U.S. government. Imagine thousands of dollars coming in and out of your new territory that you're claiming, and you're going to want to collect duties or taxes on that, right? So they stationed here to keep an eye on the operation, Henry Cruz. And Officer Cruz actually was disciplined multiple times for harassing the people living on Yusepa Island. He apparently was racist, and I can't remember his rank, but Brooks from Fort Brooke, he actually disciplined him multiple times for really mistreating the people there. And so he was not on good terms with the people. Then you have, during the Seminole War, you have Waihoki, as his name was written. His name may have translated to something like Left Behind, might be a translation for that, which is an interesting name. Him and about 25 men attacked Officer Cruz, the post, and they killed the officer. But during the Seminole Wars, if you were an indigenous person working with the Americans, you were seen as a traitor no matter what. So they also burned down all of the huts on the island, this war party. And so the people fled in canoes, and as they were fleeing from the island out towards the Gulf from Boca Grande, here come 2 U.S. Navy vessels out of Tampa. And so they encounter them, and they see these people, they bring them on board, and then they go and pursue this war party down across the islands, probably across Sanibel, to the mainland, and they lost them. But that's an interesting story because for one reason or another, the people didn't come back here. The fisheries were essentially done here until Americans would later settle in this area. So they ended up in Tampa, and this spot right here, that's Fort Brooke. That's my family lived there for a couple generations in the fort. there's a term called hang around the fort Indians. Those are natives who work with the colonizer government, and they're maybe seen as traitors, and that was my family, unfortunately. But they lived also here at Spanish Town Creek. My ancestor Juan and Gregorio, the man who ended up getting the deed to that land, left those two as executors of his will. That's now a really posh little community called Hyde Park in Tampa. And that's right there, kind of downtown. And then you can see a number of other Seminole towns here and ranchos down as we get down going towards Sarasota. And then the Mullet Keys. And then here we have Maximo Point that I just talked about, where the bridge comes across. Here's another older map that shows the friendly Indians where my family lived. That was nice. And Fort Brooke. And then here are the other fisheries. So General Thomas Jessup, he was commander, in charge of the wars, and was intent on his job, which was to forcibly remove and evict all of the indigenous people out of Florida. What's interesting about this is, when you read through those primary records, we see things in the 21st century through a certain lens. And it's interesting to read these records because it was very much, they didn't refer to the United States, the American records don't refer to the United States, they say the white man and the Indian. So it's a very, very race based, removal and what you would call like the definition of an ethnic cleansing, removing people from their land forcibly. And he was intent on that. He had motivation. He knew that they were supplying arms to the resistance. So he cited things like the treaties. The treaties, he said, these are his some of these are direct quotes. The treaties required all Indians to be confined to the reservations, including the Spanish Indians, Spanish Seminole. All Indian men and their family, whether of the rancho or the coast, are subject to that Treaty of Payne's Landing, whether they were there or not. All Indian women who have settled at the rancho or the coast, with their families, whether of mixed or full blood, and all Indians and their children who the chiefs may demand. And we have examples of this. There was a chief named Hawate Emafa, and he said, those are my people. He voluntarily went out to Oklahoma, Indian Territory, and he said, they're coming with me. So it was a really complex, interesting situation. They were rounded up and detained at Fort Brooke. One day, the men were out fishing, and the army went in and took all the women and children, and anybody who was there, and brought them into the fort, confined them. They ended up having a whole separate area for Indians that were kept at the fort. And then my family lived there, and then they built special barracks that my family lived in. There were one particular documented case. There were 243 Seminoles sent out on one boat. That included 150 to 160 Spanish Indians from here, Charlotte Harbor at the time was used to refer to from Sanibel, Punta Rassa, all the way up to what's actually Charlotte Harbor. And the Arkansas Gazette in 1838 wrote, 150 Spanish Indians or Spaniards who have intermarried with a Seminole take the whole party as a body. It's the most dirty, naked, and squalid one we have ever seen. They have been hunted out of the fastness of their native country like wild animals and have been herded aboard the boats with no opportunity to secure and bring with them their meager personal belongings. So he was saying that, this group that was being brought out was hasty, and they weren't really in good conditions at all. So there was a petition that my family was in, among a total of 21 Spanish Seminole or Spanish Indian men and their families. A number of these men, may have been mixed blood Indian, they may have been fully Spanish, they may have been Latino or Mestizo from other colonies, but they all petitioned to remain here with their families. And the petition said that, yes, they were Seminole, but they were not part of the resistance. They were not fighting in that war. They never lived on the reservation, so they said they were not subject to those treaties. They never lived on the res. They pledged their allegiance to serve the United States if they were allowed to stay. They offered to remain at the fort until the Seminole had been removed. And they said their families lived here before it was part of the U.S. They had a long-established custom to marry Seminole women, and the Spanish government recognized these marriages. Again, interesting, but it was true. And the baptisms proved the legitimacy of their marriages. So they used all of those records that we looked at to say, you know, we're different from the other Seminole. We should be able to stay. They also pled that, you know, they would not be able to make a living. They're fishermen. How would they make a living in Oklahoma? And that, you know, those were all part. And so there were two American men, white men, a judge and a proprietor of the ranchos, who was essentially a profiteer or whatever. And they wrote this petition on behalf of all of them, including Juan, my ancestor. So Juan, a little bit about him. From the records, the Montes de Oca family traveled down from Choconicla to Sanibel. Then he was documented at Spanish Town Creek and Fort Brooke later. He spoke all four languages: Spanish, English, Ilapongi, and Muskogee Obanaga, which is the Creek language. And I talked a little bit about his marriages. There's a lot that's been written and romanticized about him, like a couple of books. They seem to play off of each other, but there was an author named Tony Pizzo. He lived in Tampa. He really wanted to kind of document the Latin heritage. He was Italian, or of Italian descent. So he wrote a little bit about Juan. This is a younger Jake Stokes, descended from Juan, my great-grandfather. And then he wrote that he married a beautiful Seminole princess, which, if you ever hear princess being referred to as with an indigenous person, you know, Cherokee princess, those don't really exist. So that's a romanticized kind of tale or myth. So they really romanticized this story of Juan, but they said that she came from this town right next to Tampa, which means the place of the flint. And we do know that Mary, my ancestor, Maria, lived with Juan at Fort Brooke, and that was when he petitioned to stay, and they had 4 children, including Manuel. So he worked for at least 36 years. The rest of his life, he pledged allegiance to work for the U.S. He was a translator. So he would travel out with the Army, and I found all sorts of pay receipts and correspondence between officers about him, about the work he did, newspaper articles like this one about his work going out and translating on these diplomatic parties out to go and meet with Seminole and Miccosukee leaders. This article said that Captain Montes de Oca is better. So he, being a commercial fisherman, he would help with all sorts of things. He ran mail. I found pay receipts from him running mail from Tampa down to Miami. So he did all sorts of things just to survive, you know, make a living. But he knew what was going on better than anyone else. He worked all the way up from above Tampa down to the Everglades. One example is he would partner sometimes with local Seminole guides who knew their way around, like Polly Bermudez. Her story is a whole interesting one too. She was a Spanish Seminole, Spanish Indian. He would translate, so she knew her way around. He would translate, and the story of her though is that her husband, Chachi, there's different ways that his name was written, was a chief over around Palm Beach, or, you know, West Palm, and he was captured. So the story is the Army was looking for them. They were hiding in a swampy land. That they were so scared of the Army finding them that the babies crying, they covered their mouths and the babies would suffocate because they were they had the rest of their families to worry about. They didn't want to be captured, and they captured them, and they let them live, but they moved them over to Sarasota area, and he ended up committing suicide. And then she went on to remarry Andy Bermudez, I can't remember his first name, in Sarasota. And their family intermarried with mine. And then Juan, as I mentioned, was one of the founding members of that church. His son served in the Civil War in a company of Indians and Spaniards, including Manuel, my ancestor. They moved out to Manuel and Johnny Johns. Johns is a Seminole surname from the present-day community at the Brighton Reservation, just north of Lake Okeechobee. And our families were always really intertwined with the Tallahassee band, which is the band that ended up living on that reservation today. And the Johns family is interesting, but what's interesting is Johnny Montes de Oca actually went by Johnny Johns, and his kids were listed as Johnny Johns as well. And they started cattle ranches, and really kind of cool stuff when you look into that. Some of that's in the book. There's stories of like Chief Tallahassee naming Jake's father. His name was Little Tallahassee, and even on his World War II records, it said Tallahassee Stokes. So, and the story, what's kind of cool is I found a corroborating story from an interview from Chief Tallahassee where that story was handed down to my family for generations. And then there's a story of Chief Tallahassee telling his part and saying, you know, he took a beaded necklace off of one of the women with him and put it on the baby and named him. But my great-great-grandfather kept the name Tallahassee his whole life. And then my family, Jake, came back to Sanibel and spent his life as a commercial fisherman. So what happened to the Spanish Seminole? Hundreds were forcibly removed out to Oklahoma, and that's today the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. And then others are among the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, the Seminole tribe of Florida, and then those independent Seminole communities that have never come in under those governments that are recognized by the United States. And then if you talk to many Seminole people, they'll say that they have some Spanish ancestry, which probably comes from these ranchos. And then our two families are the only two that I know. A lot of people just disappeared from the record. They weren't able to go back to Cuba. At that time, Cuba had passed laws on immigration, so they couldn't just come from Florida if they weren't born down there. And so some of them may have gone to Mexico, they may have gone to other colonies, or they may have been removed to Indian Territory. All right, I'm going to drink a little water. Any questions? Yes.
The Indian reservation off of Alligator Alley, they have like a museum there, and is that the Miccosukee?
Miccosukee, yeah.
Miccosukee.
Yeah. So there are several reservations in Florida. I think there are 5 Seminole reservations and then the Miccosukee Reservation. The Miccosukee Reservation is kind of based off of the Tamiami Trail, right as it comes out of Miami. And then if you're going across Alligator Alley, you cross the Miccosukee Reservation, but the Big Cypress Reservation is there as well, and that's a Seminole reservation, and that's where the Atatiki Museum is, if that's what you're referring to.
Maybe, yeah.
And so a lot of the families are intertwined, but they're two separate people.
Okay.
Different languages and everything, but there's those reservations. There's one in Tampa, one in, there's Brighton, and there's another by Fort Pierce, I believe, and I think they maybe have acquired, Hollywood, where I'm going this weekend, and the Hollywood Reservation. And I think there have been recent lands that have been acquired by the Seminole Tribe of Florida that are being put in trust to become like a reservation. Yes?
So when did your family come back to Sanibel and where did they live?
Good question. So when did my family return to Sanibel after everybody left in 1836? So Jake Stokes moved down here in, I think, the 1920s, but he married into my great-grandmother's family that is one of the American pioneer families of the island, several of them. So if you go to the little chapel by the sea on Captiva Island, the little cemetery there. If you see Art Gibson's grave, that's my mom's great uncle, the Gibson family. If you go to the Sanibel Historic Village, they have a little Buck cottage that belonged to my family, the Buck side. So the Buck family, they had the first car on the island, the first car accident on the island, claim to fame. Buck Key is named after my great grandfather, with a lot of photos of my family, but you'll see some, like for instance, Jake's stepfather was the lighthouse keeper, and so Charles LaBeouf who a lot of you may know of if you're familiar with the history. Awesome guy. He was a really, really, really close friend of my grandmother, him and his wife Jean, and his kids grew up with my parents. And I've been in his talks before when I was a teenager, and he would like put the pointer on me and be like, that was his grandfather. And so we're one of those pioneer families that he returned and then married into. So it's kind of continuous here, but there's that gap with the Montes de Oca. Any other questions? Yes?
So how big population-wise was the Spanish Seminole relative to the Seminole?
So, good question. We know that it was documented that there were about 600 people here in the ranchos, primarily Seminole people, or Spanish Indians or Spanish Seminoles. So they documented 600. And it was documented that they were considered to be one band out of 4 bands of Seminoles that were engaged in the war. And then after the war, there was a green corn dance it was either towards the end of the war or after the war. But there was essentially, it's like a New Year celebration ceremony that was held at Big Cypress. And the 4 bands were there, they were present, represented, and the Spanish Indians were one of the bands that were represented there. I think the majority of them that stayed were incorporated into the Miccosukee. There's an island in the Everglades, a tree island that they call Chiqueca Island, and it's named after Chiqueca, who led that battle. And that's really a very tragic story as well. So he escaped, the army pursued him, and they actually tracked him down to this island. I think it's right off US 41, not far from Shark Valley. A good friend of mine, Houston Cypress, has taken me out to some of their little camps that they have on different islands. So they have huts and things out on those islands. And that particular island, the army tracked him there, and they held women like at gunpoint to show them where the island was. They approached and they disguised themselves as Seminole. They put on Seminole clothing. I think they did something to some people and then took their clothing and then disguised themselves, so they were able to sneak up. And they actually captured his family, and they executed him in front of his family, like very, very brutally. And so some of that is outlined in the book, but my point is that those bands were all very intertwined, but they were identified by the Army as being 4 specific bands. And I don't know if there's an estimate of the population of all the others, but 600 I think is a pretty large number for a band at that time. The Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida today I think is somewhere around 500 members, don't hold me to that. And we're talking about the population basically from Boca Grande down to Sanibel. All right, so I might, if anybody has one more question, I might take one more and then we'll wrap up. Yes?
You mentioned the Calusas. The Calusas were pretty much gone entirely, except for a few here and there, before the Seminoles came in, is that right? And I was just wondering if there's anything from the Calusa culture that got picked up within the Seminole culture.
Quite a bit, yes. So the Calusa were largely chased out or enslaved by British allied tribes. And by the time there were permanent settlements of Miccosukee and Seminole people in this area, they'd always been in this area, but not necessarily permanently. They incorporated in remnants. But during that period of the ranchos, there is, we know that they were teaching the fishermen how to fish, the Calusa who were still here in the early period, were teaching them how to make nets, how to use the nets, because the Cubans were using lines, and they really didn't catch that many fish. They learned from the Calusa that the nets were really the way to go. And so that represents, when I worked at the Florida Museum of Natural History, we had an exhibit that I think they're taking down right now. But it shows 6,000 years of continuous fishing culture, material culture, here in Southwest Florida. And it started 6,000 years ago and goes all the way through my great-granddad and my granddad who were commercial fishermen. So, and a lot of that's in the book. All right, thank you, everybody.